The following text was posted by the Reset Era user known as Omnipotent, an anonymous video game industry insider who had a contact or contacts within From Software. This post is not speculation. This text was posted on February 17, 2020, and is the fifth and final significant information post by Omnipotent on Elden Ring. The text is titled, Omnipotent Lore Post. The world and lore of Elden Ring are probably my favorite aspects of the game and big reasons as to why I consider it to be a potential personal all-time favorite. I've always dug the lore in these games and the places we inhabit, some far more than others, but it's always the connective tissue that can really make or break a game for me, and at times, is the deciding factor in whether or not I'll even give a game a chance. That being said, being a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire and From Software games, the collaboration between the top minds of both is of course a dream come true for me. So let's take a bit of a look into why this collaboration is so cool. Before we begin, I think it's worth once again reinstating that GRRM did not write the narrative of this game. He wrote the backstory and world history of Elden Ring as well as collaborating with Miyazaki and From Software on the world itself. Miyazaki handled the narrative instead, and Martin's writings are used as world history. There was no hardline rules on how they had to adapt his writings, and they were free to interpret them as they see fit, and create based on that. This is the nature of this collaboration. So as we discussed prior in the context of fantasy and A Song of Ice and Fire, Martin's best qualities are his incredibly detailed world building through his ability to create believable, living, breathing worlds that have a large sense of scope and an almost encyclopedic sense of history. On top of that, he has a great knack for bringing in well-trodden concepts and ideas in the realm of fantasy and making them interesting either by twisting them or by their placement in a larger whole. That is what's being brought to the table here. A history that delves into the statecraft of this world, political confrontations, its major players and powers and other important presences whose influences and impact can be felt into this day. Usual From Software stuff to some extent, but obviously with a bit more emphasis placed on the importance of these things, rather than having it be the usual very much in the background, blink and you'll miss it stuff. Important inhabitants of the world aren't just humans or not humans, though you as the player character will be, with everything else being an enemy of vague intelligence, but you'll be opened up to a much wider variety of interesting folk on your journey, different races, some of which may have similar fantasy roots as races already explored in past games but explored differently, the likes of some you may have already glimpsed in the trailer. Others will be new with their own From Software tinge. Different races out in the world add a lot of personality, variety and vibrancy that wasn't really there before, as the majority of who you meet are generally human or some form of human-esque. My reasoning for labeling Elden Ring high fantasy begins there. The scope of the world, lore and narrative is more grandiose than past games in pretty much every way, to match the new greater scope of the game it's meant to inhabit, in addition to a tone that strays a bit further from convention into territory of being brighter than usual From Software fare, but being a George R.R. Martin From Software game, it'll have its dark moments. From the concept of the Elden Ring down to the major players involved in this world, even down to things more simple like the functions of magic, and its place and purpose in this world, as well as those who wield it being more fleshed out than usual, both in terms of their sub-narrative as well as organizations of their own. It's immediately clear that a lot of time and effort was put into fully realizing this world, and everything in it, arguably to a degree unseen in past games. Skulls of magic aren't just about what sort of element you wield, but which skull matches the ideals you most closely adhere to, and which organization you might feel more connected to. Things that will be explored through their visual design and in-game narratives. As for the Elden Ring itself, I think it's my favorite From Software concept yet, and it's deeply tied into the world itself in a number of aspects. I personally would argue more so than the likes of the Dark Sign, Souls, the linking of the 5-year-old blood. As those prior examples were aberrations of the natural order and state of the world, the Elden Ring was the state of the world, and obviously when something like that is shattered, everything is affected. To draw a bit of a parallel to our world, we have things like the moon, our magnetic field, our atmosphere. All of these things have an important role in our life on Earth that is so intrinsic to our existence, that having one over all of these things removed would change the planet and all life on it. The moon has an effect on animal life, and is used to guide behaviors in different species, as well as the tides. It was once used to measure the passage of long periods of time. The magnetic field helps keep us safe from the likes of cosmic storms and solar flares, as well as affecting the fundamental force of magnetism, which is also used by many guiding instruments. I shouldn't need to explain why our atmosphere is important, and if you need further proof, look at Mars. But why is that relevant? Because the Elden Ring is a fundamental force of this world on that scale, and while its loss hasn't literally wiped all life off the face of the planet, it's had a number of more exciting fantastical effects on the world. What happens to the land without it, its people, its visible and tangible effects? What happens when the barrier comes down and all the worst and unimaginable things it was keeping out start to make their way in? When someone you once knew becomes something when existence itself and everything within and around it just stops working as intended. Its influence has seeped into everything for better or worse, and you get to witness the results of that. How do you deal with that? How do the people around you deal with that? Governing bodies, nations, the divine royalty of gods and demigods. How and where does everything intersect? What comes next? And it's not just about reading about it through lore, but going out there and seeing it for yourself, experiencing it and having it be represented in every aspect of the world around you. Expanding on environmental storytelling, so what does that leave you with? A world in turmoil, strife and conflict amongst peoples in which the forces of existence itself have been broken, and the ensuing aftermath of which you get to wade through and experience for yourself across great distances and locales that are equally as grandiose as the world they inhabit, that really bring in that high fantasy feeling to your trek, not taking place in just a single land like past titles, but multiple with their own distinct qualities, characteristics, visuals and recognizable inhabitants. This will be more of a journey than ever. Part of making that world and journey more engaging and believable though is populating the world with interesting characters for you to meet, with their own journey and stories, and that's another aspect that From Software is making an effort to improve on. A lot more characters with stories that will span further across the game in terms of location and story progression, with their own motives and personal ambitions. Like the larger and more involved NPC quests of Dark Souls 3, but on a more consistent scale. The player themselves also gets a more interesting and involved personal narrative beyond go here, do thing, save land because I said so. What you're left with is a larger world than Dark Souls, but places that aren't just alluded to, but you get to explore yourself, facing a more intense and far further reaching internal, as well as existential calamity, when fundamental forces of this universe are broken. Leaders and nations, the divine and the fiendish, all in conflict and you finding your place throughout all of this. Resulting in a powerful narrative with more dramatic weight than preceding titles, but not any more overbearing.